is the Jewish plot to kill Paul. That's what we're going to look at. God just promised Paul in Acts 23, verse 11. Where is Paul going to go? Where is he going to make it?
Rome.
He's going to make it to Rome. And no sooner than God says, you're going to make it to Rome, that there is a plot of these Jewish people, and they enter into verse number 12. What do they enter into? A curse, an oath, that they will not even eat. They go on people do that still today. They go on a fast. So we will not eat until Paul's dead. That's putting pressure on yourself to go kill him, because they want to have dinner. So here is a great example of providential protection. That's the blank under letter F. God uses unexpected people. He raises up. And we talked about the chief Roman officer that God raised up for Paul to protect him numerous times, as well as his nephew, as well as others who are going to protect him from death. So verse 12 through 15, we see the plot is formed. How many people enter into this oath to kill Paul? Verse number 13, 40, more than, but 40 is the number. More than 40 conspire now, and they bind themselves under a curse, not to eat or drink. And we mentioned, and I do find it very fascinating how often Claudius Lysias just keeps coming up in this while Paul is in Jerusalem under arrest. And here we see him come up again in verse 15. But he's part of the plot, but he's a person that they're going to what? In verse 15. Who could read that? Acts 23:15. Esther, do you have that verse for us?
Yes, Pastor. Now therefore ye with the council signify the chief captain that you bring him down into you tomorrow, as though you would inquire something more perfectly concerning him, and we or ever he come near are ready to kill him.
Okay, so they're using it as an unwitting pawn. He doesn't know he's being used by these conspirators, but they want to use Claudius Lysias to bring Paul to them. So he's part of their plot. They want to use him without him knowing that he's part of their sinister deed. But God has ears in amazing places, because it says Paul's sister's son, his nephew, heard. So his ears were open to whatever they were talking about. This is God's providential protection. And so when he hears about it, he tells Paul, right? And so we see number 2, page 20, verse 16, the plot is uncovered. The plot is uncovered, so the plot is formed or hatched. Now it's uncovered. And letter A, what's in that blank? I already said it. Paul's who? His nephew tells Paul about the plot. Then the nephew is brought to Claudius Lysias again. He comes up here where he's not going to be used as a pawn to bring Paul to these ones who want his death. God is going to use Claudius Lysias again to protect Paul. And so the nephew is brought to Claudius Lysias. He tells him the plan. Claudius Lysias takes him aside privately. And in a way, this is, the way I count it, the third conversation that Claudius Lysias has had with Paul. This one is indirect, but this is a conversation Paul had with his nephew to then go tell Claudius Lysias of a plot. So Claudius Lysias has had a lot of personal interaction with Paul. Remember, it was Claudius Lysias who, when this whole first thing was an uproar, he thought Paul was a what? He says, are you that Egyptian? And then he was going to scourge Paul and even have him beaten. But then he realized he was a what? A Roman citizen. So Claudius Lysias is getting to know Paul here. And now he's being used to protect him. And here's from Paul's nephew what's going on. So he hears really Paul's story through his nephew. And then he sends Paul's nephew on his way. He says, don't tell anybody what's going on. So that's all the way down to verse 22. See, thou tell no man what you have showed, that thou hast showed these things to me. So now what does Claudius Lysias do? Because we see number 3, the plot is frustrated. And look on page 131 in your Wiersbe book. And also, and to me, the details are amazing. The details of the scripture are amazing. So, who is going to protect Paul from this plot? Verse number 23. Let's read the text first. Acts 23:23. And who's got that verse for us? Joni, could you read that, please?
And he called unto him 2 centurions, saying, make ready 200 soldiers to go to Caesarea, and horsemen 70, and spearmen 200 at the 3rd hour of the night.
Okay, so count all that up. So we got, do the math, 2 centurions. How many soldiers? 200. How many horsemen? 70. So we're up to how many? 272. And spearmen? Another 200. So 472. That's how many soldiers. And Wiersbe says God arranged for 470 soldiers. He missed the 2 centurions, but that's pretty amazing. 472 soldiers protect Paul against this plot. And so now again, they're in Jerusalem, and they're going to make their way to Caesarea. And now they leave at the 3rd hour of the night. Do you know what time that is? Wiersbe tells us at the bottom of page 131. What time is that? The last paragraph there, 131. Yeah, around. Why is it the 3rd hour? Think about it. When does their day start? At sundown. So at like 6, so the 3rd hour would be 9 p.m. Okay, so they make their journey at night. And his goal, and in verse 24, you may want to just mark that also, because all of chapter 24, Paul is going to be before Governor Felix. Here's the first reference to Felix now in chapter 23, verse 24, because his goal was to bring him safe. And so here we see a letter from Claudius Lysias to Felix. So I think this is the only time his whole name is given, when he writes a letter in verse 26. Claudius Lysias, this chief captain. And he writes to Felix. And notice his side of the story. This is going to be important later on. But his side of the story is this. He says, Felix, verse 27, this man was taken of the Jews and should have been killed of them. Then came I with an army and rescued him, having understood that he was a Roman. Is that true? Is all of that accurate? Yes. That is an accurate summary of what happened. He says, and what I would have known the cause wherewith they accused him, I brought him forth into their council, whom I perceived to be accused of questions about their law, to have nothing laid to his charge worthy of death or of bonds. And when it was told me how the Jews lay wait for the man, I sent straightway to thee, and have commandment to his accusers also to say before thee that they had against him farewell. So really, Claudius Lysias, he's a faithful man. He's doing his job, as many military people do. And actually the Roman soldiers that Luke mentions in the book of Acts, who was the first Roman soldier he mentioned? Acts 10?
Was it the jail?
No, that was in Philippi. But in Acts 10, remember who Cornelius, the Roman centurion, he was a good man, and God saved him. And now Claudius Lysias also, it doesn't ever say he was saved. Maybe I hope he got saved. I really do. I think he's a hardworking person. He's putting himself out there. He's doing the best job he can, but he seems to have some very good character to him. So anyway, so Claudius Lysias, I believe that's really where we end with him. So letter A, Claudius Lysias prepares a military escort, about 472 soldiers, we counted it. Claudius Lysias writes a Governor Felix, 25 to 30, and save Paul from death once again. It's probably, I think, the third time he saved Paul. And letter C, Claudius Lysias soldiers escort Paul to Caesarea in Herod's judgment. Now, also, there's another detail in the Bible. So look at your. Do you have your Holman Bible Atlas? We're doing New Testament geography actually in the Book of Acts. We can skip over this part later on, but look at page 250. Look at page 250 because again, there's a detail in the Scripture. And I'm not sure why all these details are given, but they're here, so let's look at them. And what's the detail I'm talking about? In verse 31, Acts 23:31. Who's got that verse? Hillary, do you have Acts 23:31?
Then the soldiers, as it was commanded them, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipus.
Okay, so look in your map on that page, and because this map is actually dedicated to this journey of Paul's arrest and imprisonment and his journey from Jerusalem to Caesarea. And so he's been arrested in Jerusalem, and then they have to go through the hill country down to the Shpela, and they go to Antipus. Thank you. And so all 472 soldiers escort Paul to Antipus. And I'm having a hard time with that word. Antipus. Then when you get there, though, what happens? What does it say? Verse 32. And who's got that verse for us? Frida, could you read Acts 23, verse 32, please?
On the morrow they left the horsemen to go with him and return to the castle.
Okay, so on the morrow, they only left the horsemen with Paul. How many and go back to verse 23. How many horsemen?
70.
Yeah, just the horsemen, and so there were 70 of them. So Wiersbe says all this as well on page 131. If you look at in your book on page 131, who can read that bottom paragraph there? Who's got that? Eunice, do you have it? Okay.
Leaving at 9 o'clock that night, Paul and his escort went from Jerusalem to Antipatris, about 37 miles away. This must have been an all-night forced march for that many people to cover that much ground in that short a time. The cavalry then continued with Paul while the 200 soldiers returned to the barracks, since the dangerous part of the trip was now over. They traveled another 27 miles to Caesarea, where Paul was officially turned over to Felix. Paul was saved from the Jewish plotters, but was he saved from Felix?
Okay, and so it says that the horsemen went with him, but the other soldiers went back. Well,
Return to the barracks.
no, it says the soldiers took Paul, brought him to prison on the morrow. They left the horsemen to go and returned. They left the horsemen to go with him. So actually, it could have been the 400. So maybe he got that wrong there. But I'd have to. It made sense to me when I was preparing for the class. But now, but he did say just 200. But there were 200 soldiers, and then 200 spearmen. So it just seems that they left the horsemen to go with him. So perhaps it should be that 400 went back. Anyway, the point is that detail is given that a certain number of soldiers went with him where it was really dangerous. So God knows how much protection we need along the way, though. It's just interesting that a great number went out of Jerusalem where the danger was greatest. When they got away from the danger, then the other soldiers went back, and then still a cavalry of some form went with Paul from Antipatris to Caesarea. I don't know why I can't say that word tonight. Antipatris.
Perfect.
Can't say it. Okay. All right. So that's that. So now, here's the thing so just look back at our notes now, just to get an overview. Go back to page 20 for just a moment, where we're seeing Paul and his trials. So the first part of this section from chapter 13 was Paul and his journeys, his missionary journeys. And now we're Paul and his trials, where he comes under arrest when he goes to Jerusalem. So this section is broken down into the places where Paul is. First, he's in Jerusalem, where he's going to defend his faith. So look at the main points, just to follow the flow of this now. So he's in Jerusalem. The first thing that happens is he's confronted by the church. That's letter A. You see that? Now go down. What's letter B on page 21? He's confronted by the church. Then he goes into the temple, and he is what? Attacked by the mob. And that's really where he then comes under arrest. And he's arrested at that point, letter C, the arrest by the Romans. And that's where Claudius Lysias first comes in. If not for him, and perhaps upward of 200 soldiers, Paul could have been killed even at that point. Okay, so he confronts the church. He's attacked by a mob. He's arrested by the Romans. Then Paul makes two what? Letter D and E. What is that? He makes two defenses to the Jewish Sanhedrin. So Paul makes, this is what you got to know now, he makes two separate defenses of his faith, of his doctrine, of his behavior to the Jewish Sanhedrin in Jerusalem. And you remember when he gave his testimony to the Sanhedrin in Acts 22 in his first defense? What was the word that ended his testimony?
Resurrection.
No.
Yeah.
What was the word that ended his defense? The word Gentiles. When God says, I'm going to go far hence to the Gentiles, they're like, whoa, no way. So that set him off the edge. And they wanted to kill him again after that. And Claudius Lysias steps in once again and saves Paul's life. Okay, so Paul in Jerusalem makes two defenses. The first, he really gave his testimony, and that ended when he said the word Gentile. The second defense, remember when he was before the Sanhedrin, he witnessed of the Pharisees were there. So what did he give a testimony of? A witness. He says, I'm brought to you before you on what? What is my hope? 23 verse 6. Resurrection. And when he said that, what happened? They started fighting with each other. They started fighting. And it ended. The dissension arose so much. Again, they were going to do what to Paul in verse 10 of Acts 23? They were going to pull him in pieces. But who saved him again? Claudius saved him again. So then God says, Paul, you're going to go to Rome. And after he does that, then they make another plot. And who saves Paul again? Claudius Lysias. So I'm counting at least 3 times Claudius Lysias saves Paul from death as Paul makes 2 defenses to the Sanhedrin. So now we go to Caesarea, where Paul is going to stand on trial. And here we see, so Paul is out of Jerusalem, and he's in Caesarea. We saw it on the map. And phase 1, Paul is before Governor Felix, Acts chapter 24. He's before Governor Felix. Now look on page 132 in your Wiersbe book, please. 132. And even at the top of right at the top. And Micah, could you please read that first top paragraph there?
Antonius Felix was governor, procurator of Judea. He was married to Drusilla, a Jewess who was daughter of Herod Agrippa I, Acts 12:1, and who left her husband to become Felix's third wife. She was sister of Herod Agrippa II, Acts 25:1-13. The Roman historian Tacitus said that Felix exercised the power of a king in the spirit of a slave. Felix was called a vulgar ruffian and lived up to the name.
Okay, not a man of strong character. Okay, now put in your book, maybe a little note, also page 143. Now go to page 143 and know this about Felix. His wife is mentioned. His wife's name is Drusilla. And her name is mentioned in the text in Acts 24:24. And later on, we're going to come to Agrippa, where Paul witnesses before Agrippa. And is Agrippa's wife mentioned? Yes. Remember her name? Does anybody know her name offhand? It begins with a B. Her name is Bernice or Bernice. Okay, so both Felix and Agrippa have their wife mentioned. And so good to know that. So Felix's wife is Drusilla, and you see where she is really related to these different Herods too, who have done awful things throughout history. Now look at page 143, please. There's also another interesting point here about Felix and Drusilla at the bottom of page 143, the last paragraph there of that page, where it says it must have been the curiosity of his wife. Who can, Jeannie, do you have that? Could you read that, please?
It must have been the curiosity of his wife Drusilla that prompted Felix to give Paul another. He had been involved with the way on several occasions. Her great-grandfather tried to kill Jesus in Bethlehem, and her great-uncle killed John the Baptist and mocked Jesus. And tells of her father killing the apostle James.
Okay. So, yeah, so there's a lot of interaction there with Jesus Christ and with the gospel over time. So that's Drusilla, the wife of Felix. She's mentioned, we'll come to her. Okay, so here's the civil trial, phase 1. Paul before Governor Felix. Governor Felix is present throughout this chapter as Paul is accused of the Jewish leaders. So here's how this chapter is broken down. Verses 1-9, we see basically the lawyer of the Jewish Sanhedrin, the Jewish high priest. The lawyer, his name, and he's called here a spokesman or an orator. He's called an orator in the King James text. His name is Tertullus. Tertullus. And he is going to present how evil Paul is and why they should, incarcerate him and have him, whatever they want done with him, killed. So Tertullus is going to accuse Paul. Now, before he does that, in verses 1-4, what does your note say? Most noble Felix, you are so wonderful. We come to you with all thankfulness. And Tertullus is waxing so sweet, so syrupy, and he flatters Tertullus with the best sugar he can muster, with all these beautiful words. And he says, "Oh, most noble Felix." And look at even verse 4. I had to look up some of these words, but he says, "Notwithstanding that I be not further," what's the word after that? Tedious. I don't know if anyone has another. Do you have another translation? Often Ellie does. Just curious. What is that another translation put for tedious?
What verse?
Verse 4.
Nevertheless, not to be tedious to you any further, I beg you to hear by your courtesy a few words from us.
Okay, so I'm not, tedious is a good word, but I think in that context we might wonder exactly. Don't you kind of wonder, like, what does it mean? I don't want to be tedious. The idea is I don't want to get down into the weeds too much with you and waste your time. I don't want to impede. I don't want to impose upon you. Let me get right to the point. That's really, I think, what he's saying. And he says, but thou wouldst hear us of thy clemency. That is, you're fair, because you're going to hear us out fairly and with a gentle attitude. That's the idea of clemency there. So he says, I don't want to take a lot of your time. I'm going to get right to the point because I know you're a fair man. Basically is what he's saying to Felix. So after flattering Felix with sweetness and sugar, he gets out his knives for Paul. There is no sweetness for Paul. Because look what are the three words in verse number 5? And two of them are at least in your notes here as he takes out his knives upon Paul. He denounces Paul, letter B, as a what? So the first 4 words of that word. He's a pest. He is a pest. He's a plague to us. He's a plague to our nation. And then he also says he's a mover of sedition. The word sedition is heresy. He's a heretic. And Paul uses that same word down in verse 14. And it's the word, it's translated heresy there, where he says, I confess to thee after that. I confess unto thee that after the way which they call heresy. So he's answering that charge right there. He says, it is not a heresy. I'm not a heretic. I'm not a mover of sedition. I worship God as was written in the law and the prophets. That's what he's saying. So he says they called him a pest, a plague, a heretic, and then it's not in your notes, but what's the third word in verse 5 that they call him? He's a ringleader. He's a champion of this way. I kind of get the sense where they believe that they could just like cut off Paul's neck, that this whole way would die. They could just chop off Paul's life, that this whole thing would just die out with it. Aha. They were wrong. So they called him a ringleader, the idea he's a front man of this sedition, of this heresy. He's a pest. So that's what they're saying of Paul here. And now, very interestingly, he accuses our man. He accuses the guy I've taken a lot of love for here, Look what he says about our man. Verse 7. Well, actually, verse 6 too. I'll read verse 6. Who also hath gone about, he went to profane the temple, whom we took and would have judged according to our law. But, verse number 7, what does that say? Sid, can you read verse 7, please?
But the chief captain Lysias came upon us, and with great violence took him away out of our hands.
Yeah. We would have dealt with this problem, but this chief captain of yours, he was the violent one. Now, wait a minute. Is that accurate?
No.
That is not accurate. That is a total misrepresentation of Claudius Lysias. Who wanted to tear Paul to pieces? The Jewish people. Who was going to kill him? Who had a plot? So 3 times he saved Paul from their violence, but they're accusing him. So this is what you call lawyers who are defending their client, who lie to do it. Lawyers don't do that, do they? So he blames Claudius Lysias, page 26, of what? Of violently taking Paul from them. They were the violent ones. Their testimony contradicts both God's testimony written by Luke, but it also, and that's another reason why we read Claudius Lysias' letter, their testimony contradicts what the letter that Felix actually has in his hand from his chief Roman officer. So now he's listening to what Tertullus is saying. He's like, this doesn't match with what Claudius Lysias has written in this letter. Because Claudius says that this man was taken of the Jews and would have killed them unless I had stepped in. So So he knows there's another story being told. So then verse 8, he says, commanding his accusers to come unto thee, by examining of whom thyself mayest take knowledge of all these things whereof we accuse him. So Claudius Lysias wanted the accusers to come so that he could be examined. So there they were. They came down. Ananias and the high priest had come down, and now they're accusing them of Paul of what they believe he did wrong. Okay, so that verses 1 through 9. Tertullus accuses Paul before Felix. Okay, and then we see Paul faithfully answer the charges. Okay, so how does Paul answer Tertullus's charge? So what did Tertullus say Paul was doing in verse 6? Sorry. To profane the temple. And what does Paul say to answer that charge in verse 12?
Neither from me the temple disputing with any man.
Yeah. So you see, he's answering that very charge. And then verse 13, Paul says what? They cannot what?
Prove.
They can't prove anything they just accused me of. And they said I was a ringleader of heresy. He answers that charge. That what they're calling heresy, I'm just worshiping God according to what's written in the law and the prophets. But Jesus Christ is the one who fulfills the law and the prophets. I can't stop this. I think this, oh no, it didn't. I thought maybe it threw it off of, let me just turn my phone off. I'm sorry. Okay, so Paul says, I'm not a ringleader of sedition. So he's answering the charges. Paul faithfully answers the charges before Felix. That's number 2. Letter A, the false charges of Tertullus. Now, Wiersbe has an interesting thing here. I'm not going to hold you to it, to know it, but I just thought it was interesting because Paul says in verse 11, again, another detail, a detail in verse 11, how many days had it been as Paul's standing before Felix now? Think of everything he's gone through in Jerusalem. He went to Jerusalem. He was keeping the vow. He went into the temple for a number of days to keep that vow. And then the mob attacked him. He was arrested and he made his defense to the Sanhedrin not once, but twice, and the plot and everything. Now he's been carried down to Caesarea. How many days have transpired? All this has happened in how many days?
12.
Verse 11, 12. And so Wiersbe actually says, here's how that could actually be 12 days. It's a lot of stuff going on in 12 days. So life is moving fast for Paul. So then he answers in verse 17 through 19, the false charges of verse 18. What does it say? He's answering the false charges that the Jews from Asia had said of him, that he had brought a Gentile into the temple. And then he says, essentially now in his response, if they want to find any evil in me, if they want to find anything wrong I've done, here's what I've done wrong. And it's verse 21. And let's see. Mary Chris, could you read, please, verse 20 and 21? Why don't you read, please, those 2 verses?
Or else let this same here say, if they have found any evil doing in me, while I stood before the council, except me for this one's voice, that I cried standing among them, touching the resurrection of the dead, I am called in question by you this day.
So is that wrong? It says the only evil I've done is I've brought out the truth of the resurrection before the Sanhedrin, and that caused an uproar. But of course, that's not wrong. That was the truth. So perhaps with a bit of holy sarcasm, I put that in your notes. Paul says if he did anything evil, it was to stand for the resurrection. For that is what caused an uproar in the Sanhedrin. Okay, so chapter 24 is really about Paul standing before Governor Felix, first being accused and now defending himself. And what blank do you need?
C.
Okay, C.
False charges of
Sanhedrin.
Awesome.
Yeah, I'm sorry. So false charges of Tertullus, false charges of the Jews, the false charges of the Sanhedrin.
Pastor, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So here, right, he admitted about he said about the resurrection of the dead and it causes like trouble. So why again on the first defense that when he mentioned the word Gentile, and why was it interrupted? I forgot like the reason.
Because the Jewish people were so sectarian, they didn't believe that the Gentiles should have, that openness to the God of Abraham that they had. It was offensive to them that Paul would go to the Gentiles and offer to them salvation freely and not going to God through obedience to the Mosaic law, not going to God through being by circumcision and so forth.
So it was mentioned in Acts 2.
What?
That could isn't that in Romans?
Yeah. Well, that was basically, just their attitudes.
Okay.
Yeah. And that even came into the church, with in the Jerusalem Council. It was really, what is the Christian relationship to the law? And, do you have to be circumcised? Do you have to come to Christ by first keeping the law? I mean, that was really what the Jerusalem Council was about. It was about doing the works of the law in order to have salvation. So that's why, and Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles, and so that set them off there in his first defense. Okay?
Thank you.
Yeah. So anybody else want to add to that? I'm sure there's something else that can be said, but it was when God said to Paul, "Depart hence, I will send thee far hence unto the Gentiles." That's the question Joni's asking. Why do you think that upset the Jewish people so much?
Verse
It's a good,
21.
yeah, it's a good question.
But they should have been reading their own Bible, right? Because it talks about it all through the Old Testament.
Right, yeah.
I mean,
I know
at least
Paul references all those verses that God would be glorified amongst the Gentiles, and he gave those scriptures, but there was a blindness to it. Okay, so let's just finish out this chapter here. And this is a beautiful passage. Why don't we just read it as well? And if we could read from, why don't we read from verse 22 to the end? And so why don't we start, please, with Maureen in the back, and can we just kind of go around this way, beginning at verse 22 of Acts chapter 24. Acts 24, verse 22 to the end of the chapter.
And when Felix heard these things, having more perfect knowledge of that way, he deferred them and said, "When Lysias the chief captain shall come down, I will know the uttermost of your matter."
And he commanded the centurion to keep Paul, and so that he had liberty, and that he should forbid one of his acquaintance to minister or come to him.
And after certain days, when Felix came with his wife Drusilla, which was a Jewess, he sent for Paul and heard him concerning the faith in Christ.
And as he reasoned of righteousness, temperance, and judgment to come, Felix trembled and answered, "Go thy way, for this time, when I have a convenient season, I will come for thee."
He hoped also that money should have been given him of Paul. that he might read him, wherefore he sent for him the oftener and communion.
Okay, verse 27. Frida, could you read verse 27?
But after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room, and Felix, willing to show the Jews a pleasure, left Paul bound.
Okay, now, what a beautiful witnessing passage of scripture this is. Paul witnesses to Felix. Think of a little of what we just read about Drusilla. Her grandfather tried to kill Jesus in Bethlehem. Her great uncle killed John the Baptist and mocked Jesus. And her father killed the apostle James. Drusilla left her husband to marry Felix, and it was her third husband. And no doubt, if Felix married a woman like Drusilla, his character was not any better. And we read something else about his character, that he had a very weak character himself. So what does Paul reason to him about? Self-control. And of judgment to come. Thinking of everything that was in his background. It must have just come like a wave of conviction of sin upon him. And what does he do? He is literally, physically trembling. But he's not repenting. And then he actually turns away from what he knows to be what he ought to do. And he just says, I'll use Paul as a pawn to maybe get some bribes from the Jewish people. And then after 2 years, Felix is replaced. Not sure why, but Festus comes into his place and Felix disappears. But he had his chance. He passed into the scripture, had his chance, trembled, and never found that more convenient time. There's a song, I think, that came about this when he says, when I have a convenient season, I'll call for thee. So Paul, we see, patiently witnesses to Felix. He reasoned to him in these 3 areas. What were they? Righteousness, temperance, judgment to come. And I put the outline of Wiersbe in your notes here at this point. If you look on page 144. So righteousness, Wiersbe says, deal with, on page 144, do you see the italics? First, he had to do something about yesterday's sin. So righteousness. Temperance is self-control, where he says today's temptations. And then judgment to come is tomorrow's judgment. I could just see Wiersbe preaching a sermon on that. And those are his 3 points. Wiersbe was he used to be on family radio a lot, by the way, on Back to the Bible. Did you ever listen? That was back a few years ago.
Right, he's from Nebraska.
Oh, Back to the Bible's out of Lincoln, Nebraska.
Oh yeah, and Woodrow Kroll came after Warren Wiersbe, right? But I used to love Warren Wiersbe. He had a really, really nice voice, very calming kind of a voice. And Woodrow Kroll was pretty good too, But Wiersbe he's just a good Bible expositor. But I believe this is one of his sermons right there. So, grab hold of those things, and you don't have to preach the exact outline, but that came out of his prayer and meditation. So Felix, of course, trembled with terror. That's letter B. But he procrastinated his decision. And a good statement under that on page 145, he says, procrastination. You see where it says on page 145 where it says he procrastinated? What does it say under that? Procrastination is the thief of time. And then read a little down. It's also the thief of souls. So I put that in your notes. Procrastination is the thief of time and souls. And notice what the conniving Felix does. He wants to use Paul for what in verse 26? What does it say? For what? For money. Power. Money is power in this world. And so he thinks as long as he keeps Paul incarcerated, he can use him to leverage to get a payout. So, oh, you want to see Paul? Well, give me some money under the table or something. And if do you want me to keep Paul in jail? Then then give me some money and I'll keep him in jail. Because he could have said, I'm going to let Paul out. No, don't let Paul out. Well, give me some money, you know. So he used Paul as a leverage for money and power. And so, on the other hand, then Felix kept in touch with Paul and communed with him, but there was no sincerity there. And then after 2 years, still he was ultimately willing to show the Jews a pleasure, to feed into their lust, and he left Paul bound. So that's the end of chapter 24, and we'll stop right there. And you know what? Good news. You know what the good news is? Oh, there's a memory verse. Yeah, we're definitely going to have a memory verse here. Actually, you know what the memory verse is? Oh, that's a long one. No, the good news is we're going to finish the book of Acts. We're on target. We're on target to finish the book of Acts. That's the good news. And I did have a really good, there's a lot of actually, okay, here's the memory verse for our next quiz. It's not a long one. I just found a nice short one for you, okay? It's going to be Acts 26:28, and we'll get there soon. That's when Agrippa said to Paul, almost thou persuadest me to be a Christian. That's a great verse. Yes.
There's 2 lines in the letter C.
Political pawn. Political pawn. He used Paul as a political pawn, either to receive a bribe or gain favor from the Jews. Oh,
You guys have 146 read it. Good.
143.
Yeah, we did.
You said that.